I have interfaced with a lot of you before, but my name is A.B. Rohrig. I am the communications director with One Day Sooner. And yeah, very happy to have this opportunity for journalists to get a chance to ask questions to signatories of One Day Sooner's open letter. So yeah, as many of you know, of course, the signatories know, One Day Sooner is an organization that started around 3 months ago to recruit interested and willing volunteers for a potential COVID-19 human challenge trial. And currently there are over 32,000 people from over 140 countries who have indicated that they would be interested in taking part in a challenge trial. Around 2 weeks ago, One Day Sooner released an open letter to Dr. Francis Collins that I'm linking in the Zoom chat now. And of course, we're joined by many signatories of that open letter. And as momentum builds for COVID-19 challenge trials, there's widespread agreement by stakeholders that public engagement is very crucial and that it's important that the public knows the logistical and ethical considerations that surround challenge trials. And so, yeah, myself and other people at One Day Sooner, including Isaac Martinez, who is the project manager on our open letter, are very grateful that there are journalists who are covering this issue. And we're also very grateful that many of the distinguished signatories on our open letter have taken the time out of their very busy schedules to answer some questions from journalists about their decision to write the open letter. And so, yeah, we think it is important for the public to know what challenge trials are, how they differ from traditional phase 3 trials, what the benefits are, what the risks are, and why people from many different academic disciplines have decided to call on the NIH to begin preparation for these trials. So with that said, just a little bit about the call itself. This call will be recorded and all comments will be on the record unless you wish to indicate otherwise immediately before or after your comment. And it will mostly be an open floor from journalists to have an opportunity to ask signatories questions about the open letter and about human challenge trials. And so with that said, I think we can go around and just do some very brief introductions. If you could just say your name and your affiliation. I'll begin. Again, just for people who've joined the call, my name is Avi. I'm communications director with One Day Sooner. Isaac, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm Isaac. I'm the project manager from One Day Sooner. So for all our signatories, I'm the one who got the emails from.
Yeah. Amelia?
Hi, I'm Amelia. I'm a documentary filmmaker for BBC and CNN feature films as well. Thank you.
John Authors?
Hi, I'm a columnist for Bloomberg and also get syndicated in the Washington Post.
Jane Whitfield? Jane, are you there? Maybe on mute or on background. Beth Wang?
Hi, sorry, I'm not going to be on video, but I'm Beth with Inside Health Policy in Washington, D.C. I'm a reporter.
Thanks. Laura?
Hi, I'm with Public News Service, and I also freelance for other outlets like Wondery.
Charlotte Gardner?
Hey, how are you? I'm with NBC in London.
Thank you. Professor Kalin?
Bill Kalin, I'm a physician scientist at Harvard Medical School and a 2019 Nobel laureate in medicine.
Professor Wickler?
Hi, I'm professor of ethics and population health at the Harvard School of Public Health.
Professor Holloway?
I am Carla Holloway, Emerita in Law and Literature at Duke University.
Professor Roth?
I'm Al Roth. I'm an economist at Stanford University.
And Sir Richard Roberts? Oh, I believe you're on mute.
I'm Rich Roberts. I'm Chief Scientific Officer at New England Biolabs and the 1993 Nobel Laureate in Medicine.
And Professor Kaplan?
Hi, Art Kaplan. I run the Medical Ethics Division at NYU School of Medicine.
Professor Rufael?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Nadine Rufael. I'm an associate professor of medicine at Emory.
Thank you. And just in time is Josh Morrison. Josh, we're just doing introductions and our affiliation.
Hey, this is Josh Morrison. I'm the executive director of One Day Sooner.
Great, thank you so much. So now we can have an open floor where journalists can ask questions to signatories. You can feel free to ask openly to the panel, or you can direct your question to a specific signatory. You can also ask directly, or if you wish to put your question in the Zoom chat, and then I can announce the question. On reserve, we also have some questions, some frequently asked questions from volunteers. So time permitting, we'd love to ask those as well. But for now, we can open the floor. Actually, first, let's just get some introductions from two people who joined the call. I believe they're joining audio right now. Hi, Kara. We were just doing introductions and naming our affiliation. Are you there? Okay, I guess on background for now. Okay, so we can open the floor. So for any journalists who have any questions about human challenge trials for any of our signatories.
Hello. Could I start? There's obviously lots of fascinating scientific and moral questions to come, but could I just start with a practical question so I understand what precisely you're trying to do? Who do you need to appeal to? Are you just appealing to the American authorities, or are you finding volunteers? Are there authorities, regulatory bodies in other countries that you need to convince? And how many of the different candidate vaccines are interested in using human challenge trials? Are you sure that there are people who will, you know, if volunteers do very bravely, and we're all very grateful to them, come forward, are we sure that there are scientists who will use their services?
This is Stanley Plotkin. In point of fact, the people in the UK are also interested because the Oxford vaccine, as you probably know, is in an advanced state of development. And there may be others in Europe now. Obviously, as we all know, Britain is splitting from the EU, so it's not clear what the result will be as far as management of regulatory issues are concerned. But one can say for sure that the UK is interested.
And do you mean by that the Oxford, you know, there's obviously other very exciting vaccine program that's candidate vaccine from Oxford would be prepared to use human challenge trials if they can persuade the relevant British authorities to let them do them?
That's my understanding, yes.
This is Josh. Yeah, that's what's been publicly reported by the Guardian, is the Oxford vaccine team's interest at the Oxford Jenner Institute. And, you know, we have talked to a few other different groups that would be interested in using challenge studies to test their vaccines, vaccine candidates. But unfortunately, the details of those are confidential at the moment. But I think, you know, Oxford as the first COVID vaccine candidate to get into phase 3 testing is, you know, one kind of good example of this. And in terms of the kind of regulatory barriers, or sort of who has to say yes, it varies a bit by geography. So the regulatory standard in the US is going to be different than it's going to be in the UK. And in the EU, I think that, you know, basically the biggest hurdle is going to be just getting the IRB approvals, the Institutional Review Board, at the different institutions that could run one of these studies. In the US, you would also likely need the FDA approval as well, but that is not necessarily the case in studies done outside the US. And the other thing in the US, you know, we're, you know, I think as an American myself, I'm very proud of the history of the National Institutes of Health. And the NIH has a lot of expertise in challenge studies and have publicly announced that they're preparing challenge virus. But there's a very open question of whether they're going to be willing to run an infectious dosing study or other challenge studies. And with all respect to the really brilliant people at Oxford, of all the people in the world, I would love to have the NIH be one of the groups running these challenge studies. And so that's one group that we would hope to advocate, to persuade to use these.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, yeah.
From my understanding, these trials are very small. It's like 20 people, and obviously, I think most of the candidates have to be in their 20s. For me, that seems. I'm just wondering how efficient that is, right? Because people in their 20s are much more likely to recover from COVID, and how the results coming from these trials are going to be so small scale, and obviously looking at very healthy candidates. And if you guys can comment a bit on that.
Well, if you wish, I will comment. This is Dr. Plotkin again. So the point of having healthy people is to reduce the risk of serious disease. But without going into a lot of detail, which is already in the literature, what challenge trials hope to do is to identify certain, or rather to answer certain important questions. For example, what are the immune responses that are protective against disease, that is spread of the virus from the nasopharynx to other parts, or for that matter, what will protect the nasopharynx from being infected. And it will allow the analysis of immune responses in a way that is not easy to do in regular phase 3 trials, because there people are becoming ill, and one gets there after the fact, whereas in challenge trials, you have specimens before the challenge.
Yeah, and this is Bill Kalen, if I could follow up, so, because this is an important question. So first of all, I think most would agree that a candidate vaccine that didn't work even in the most ideal circumstance, the young and the healthy, might be quickly excluded, but there's value to that also given the number of vaccine candidates. Conversely, if it turned out that the vaccine only worked in the relatively healthy, yes, it would have to subsequently be validated in a sicker population, those at greater risk. But nonetheless, even a vaccine that only worked amongst the healthy could be a first step towards achieving herd immunity. And we've all seen these pictures of young, healthy people congregating because they feel like they're immortal. So maybe this would be a first step towards achieving some degree of herd immunity, realizing that you would need subsequent validation that the vaccine also worked in a sicker population.
Really helpful, thank you.
So I just received a question from Beth Wang, and I'll read it aloud now. FDA's Biologics Center Director Peter Marks has said that the agency wouldn't rule out challenge study designs for COVID-19 vaccines, but the agency would have to carefully consider and weigh the ramifications of any protocol before moving forward with it. Have you all spoken with any companies or researchers that would have to go through the FDA for this, or even the FDA itself, to get an idea of how they're resolving some of the questions about challenge trial designs? And what challenges or hurdles do you see on the US regulatory side?
Well, if no one else is offering, I'll take a stab at that. Everyone who works in biology in the US is well aware of the exigences of the FDA and the necessity when doing clinical trials to satisfy the FDA. Now, I've talked to people at the FDA, and of course many others have as well, And I think it's fair to say that they are not against human challenges. What they want and what they should want is protocols that will answer important scientific questions in a way that is as safe as possible for the volunteers. And so that they will want to know how was the challenge virus constructed, and a lot of details about that, what tests were done, and what circumstances of challenge will be, how the volunteers will be protected, housed, etc. And all that is perfectly reasonable. What I would say, and I believe I'm right, is that the FDA is not against the idea, but it will have to be satisfied that these challenges will be done in the safest way and most informative way possible. And I think the same thing can be said for the British authorities. That's as much as I can say at the moment.
And I also think, this is Bill Callan again, I also think this question relates to the first question, namely, who is going to be willing to embrace challenge trials? And I would say the answer might look very different in 3 or 4 months than it does today. I think we're all hopeful that perhaps one of the very first vaccines tested will succeed, whether it's Oxford, Pfizer, or Moderna. And so there's I won't call it a honeymoon, but people can imagine a path where a challenge trial might not even be needed. But if in 3 or 4 months it becomes clear this is much more difficult than we thought it was going to be, I think many more people will start to think about the need for challenge trials. And the language in the open letter, I think, was very important and very careful. It called for immediate preparations for challenge trials because you can't do these things overnight. So I'd rather prepare in case we do really need these trials in the future, and be pleasantly surprised perhaps that maybe we got an answer the old-fashioned way with one of the first vaccines currently being tested.
Thank you for that answer. Are there any other questions from press?
Yes, please. One of the reasons, as I understand it, that Moderna is choosing not to use human challenge studies is that there's been the experience from a gene therapy study from 20 odd years ago when one of the subjects actually died. How great are the risks? Obviously, we're in the situation where a lot of people are very vaccine hesitant. How do you go about dealing with the risk that a human challenge study could ultimately put back not just the cause of this vaccine, but maybe even persuade large numbers of anxious parents against measles and so on? Is that a valid concern in your opinion, and how would you deal with it?
Well, this is Art Kaplan. The death in the University of Pennsylvania gene trial of Jesse Gelsinger was actually not a challenge study. It was a phase 1.
Oh, right.
And they're done, with new drugs, trying to be careful, and new therapies, but there's always risk in both challenge studies and phase 1 studies. I find myself sometimes thinking that those who object to the risk involved with a challenge study are going to have a hard time also accepting phase 1 studies because they can be risky despite prior animal work and lab studies. I do think it's important to stress that something that someone said earlier, you get sound data when you have people in a place and you observe them and you know what they were like before, what they're like post-vaccination, what they're like post-exposure to the agent. One way to reassure a nervous public, which keeps hearing about speed, is that you have very strong data out of the challenge study because it's highly controlled. There may be dropouts from the big 30,000 person studies. We may have despite the fact that we want diversity and different kinds of people in these studies, it may not be easy to generalize from a mixed group early on as to what the safety profile is. So starting with a small group, control group, and then expanding it out, I think actually gives you more trustworthy data. So it's not just speed, it's, to me, it's partly being able to really understand what's going on.
I have one more question as well. In terms of if these challenges or challenge trials are approved as to where they would take place, if Oxford is to green light it, can the trials take place in the United States, or do you need FDA approval in order to conduct the trials in a different country? And also, are you guys, I mean, the big conversation around the pandemic is the fact that we weren't prepared for this. Are you guys surprised by the lack of preparedness when it comes to the challenge trials? This isn't the first time that a challenge trial has taken place. Are you sort of surprised by the lack of, again, preparedness and where we are a couple of 6 months into this, still debating this question?
Well, again, a clinical study carried on in the U.S. with a product made in the U.S. must pass the FDA. And your second question was about what was it again?
Preparedness.
Preparedness for
I'll jump in over Stan and just say I'm a little surprised that we haven't begun preparations for a challenge trial. As Bill was saying, there's nothing lost in getting ready. We can still debate whether we're going to do it, but I think many people who thought we might not get an answer or a successful answer on the first couple of candidates, you want to be ready to move quickly. And yeah, I'm a little disappointed we're not preparing. I mean, I hear Stan has heard, we've heard there is some preparation now, but I think we're a little slow on that. And remember, let's say the first 5 agents fail. You're going to be in the standard modality recruiting 30,000 people per test vaccine again and again and again. You really want to be ready to go, I think, with an alternative. Even to debate the alternative, but be set up to do it.
Agreed.
But I think, this is Rich Roberts. I mean, I think one of the things that we've already learned from this pandemic is that we've been pretty much unprepared for every aspect of it so far. And so I don't find it surprising that this has come as a big shock to people, that all of a sudden one might want to do a challenge trial. If the FDA had been on the ball, and if the administration had been on the ball, we would have been doing testing, mass testing, a long time ago. We had the tests, they're available, but the FDA were very slow to approve them, and there was no pressure from the administration to speed things along. So I'm really not surprised.
I want to add, this is Carla Holloway, and go back a bit to that question about the Jesse Gelsinger trial, which Art appropriately notes was a phase 1 study. And the importance of, although I generally don't like the term health literacy, but the importance of what we're seeing today is the literacy around vaccination and the politics that have been attached to that. One of the reasons I'm a signatory to the letter is because I have written about clinical trials and disparate impacts, and am very concerned that that lack of literacy and the politicization of this moment does not interfere with a person's autonomy and ability to sign on to this kind of trial. But it will depend greatly on our own ability to adapt our literacies to the moment, and not to ignore the political reality that we're facing with a public that is consistently misinformed about vaccination anyway. And to move to this stage gives us a particular, challenge, can I say. And I think that the more kinds of people like me, a law and literature professor, who's written about this kind of thing, but from a completely different ethics perspective, have a chance to give a diversity of views in this. Perhaps we can address this literacy problem that makes people go immediately either to the Gelsinger or the Tuskegee trial as something that is going to inform this moment when it should not.
Yeah, and I'd like to, to follow up with the really smart remarks that Carla made about vaccine literacy and education and vaccine hesitancy. And, you know, I think that challenge studies, which are something that I think are going to be and have been very public and publicly notable, I think this is a real opportunity to teach the public about vaccination in an attractive and sort of charismatic way. And I know that the 30,000 people who've signed up for One Day Sooner, you know, I know that many of us feel, you know, an opportunity here to educate the public and want to be educating the public and want to be champions for vaccination. And I think this is an opportunity for that. And I think, you know, the idea that, I mean, obviously we hope and given what the data about risks are, expect that no one would die in a challenge study, but it is a possibility, it is a real risk, and it would obviously be tragic. But, you know, obviously that's logically shouldn't make people more hesitant to take vaccines. And the idea that, you know, any bad outcome that ever happens anywhere related to vaccines in any way is going to cause greater vaccine hesitancy, I think that's a, you know, overbroad assumption, especially if it's an assumption being used to say, you know, here's a method that would be useful, but God forbid there's ever any negative information in any way about vaccination. I just don't think that's the right standard to be thinking of. And then I just wanted to also address this preparation question, because it is something we've been thinking about. And we're actually I was just talking with our research director about commissioning research about this pandemic preparedness for the future as it relates to challenge studies. And yes, I think that, you know, of the many areas, as Rich said, where we've been behind the curve, both in the US specifically, but around the world, challenge studies is one of them. I think that whether you think that the challenge studies for COVID are or are not a good idea, I think it's clear that there should be a regular plan in place when there are new pathogens and where there are pandemics to get challenge material that's going to be ready and have a protocol that can be proposed. And then if you have something ready, then you can make the ethical decision, is this something you should go forward with or not? But the reality is, if we had been started preparing a challenge virus back in January or February, and then been able to do a dosing study if we had wanted in, let's say, April, we could be testing vaccines now. And it would be great to have a sense of if the vaccines that we were putting into tens of thousands of people might actually work, or, or would actually, if we had some evidence that, okay, there's going to be some efficacy here, or there's not, that would have been, a huge value. And I think everyone I think agrees with. And so I do think that this shows both the need for greater preparedness now and treating the preparations with urgency now, and then also creating a plan for future pandemics to prepare challenges and have a standard operating procedure for that's as efficient as possible.
And also, Josh, on the topic of scientific literacy, and Carla, to your point, there's a little bit of a catch-22, because the average person who's going to volunteer for, we'll call it a conventional vaccine trial, who believes in science, believes in medicine, believes in vaccines, is also likely to believe in masks and hand washing and all the other things we're telling people to do, which we actually know work reasonably well. And so in a way, that's going to be a headwind in terms of accruing the number of cases we'll need to see in the placebo groups. So the irony is just that the young and the healthy aren't necessarily representative of the broader population. The people on the conventional vaccine trials won't arguably be representative of the broader population.
Well, that's where I think the responsibility is going to come in, to talk about in which ways we can generalize the information from the study to a larger population, even though you're absolutely right, we're almost preaching to the choir. But knowing that and acknowledging that, I think the transparency of this project is critical. And at every stage, acknowledging the issue, for example, that you just brought up, is critical to the credibility of the challenge trial process in and of itself. So whether or not these have been done historically, correctly or incorrectly, I think there's a way to think about this moment as a as a unique and idiosyncratic one as well.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. First, I mean, just to ask a very cynical question, which is the virus is raging so badly in the US that it may be not that hard, arguably, to conduct these phase 3 trials. And there's going to be about 5 that are starting. So I guess I want to ask, in terms of limiting, harm, what you argue against those conditions that, just you could sort of do, maybe under normal conditions, it would be hard to get a field trial, but now it's not that hard. So, sort of what's the added value of human challenge trials? And I'm also curious, I mean, I know One Day Sooner has a lot of material in terms of how much time it would save to have a human challenge trial, but considering the rapid growth of COVID in the US, like, what are your current sort of thoughts on how much human challenge trial would save time in getting a vaccine?
Well, I'll leave it to others to do the save time thing, but I think you have to understand, I've been around recruitment issues, the ethics of recruiting subjects to trials a long time, and recruiting 30,000 people and having some drop out and decide they don't want to do it is no small task. Doing it 4 or 5 times in a row, even with rampant outbreaks, a lot of people just are going to think, I'm not sure I want to be in an experimental vaccine trial until they, if you will, get more information. There's a lot of hesitancy and doubt out there. We all know these polls, so that makes me nervous. There are sub-communities that are very nervous about getting involved in this research as well. So to me, it's big numbers, and then you have this, I hope for, possibility that maybe we'll tamp it down. So we start in some part of the country and we actually get people to put on a mask and, distance and do behavioral modification, and we get the virus down. I mean, if you'd been doing this 4 months ago, you would have done it in New York. So, we don't know. Maybe Brazil is a good place to start, but, we don't want to condemn those people to outbreaks. So it's big numbers is my answer. It's tough to recruit. And you do lose, even people who get vaccinated wander away. It's tricky.
And I would just add to what Art said by pointing out that that a phase 3 trial necessarily means that you're looking for disease and possibly death in the control group. So phase 3 trials are certainly not safe because when you enter, you don't know whether you're getting the vaccine or the control. And if one of the vaccines or 1 or 2 of the vaccines fail, and the phase 3 trial is done, and there's no difference between the vaccinated group and the control group, that's a lot of people who are sick and perhaps die. So my point is simply that phase 3 trials are not without risk, and they don't give as much scientific information as a controlled challenge trial.
And yeah, just to answer your question as well, first, I don't think we should, in the United States, should give up on suppressing the virus like basically every other developed country has managed to do. And I think it was, Art made this point of if you looked a few months ago, it would have been you would have done this in New York. And the same thing, in England a few months ago, Oxford thought, oh, we can test this here. There's high infection rates. We'll have an answer by September. But then suppression was effective. And the thing to realize is that I believe that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines both need booster shots. And so you're talking about, someone told me today, maybe it's about 2 to 6 weeks or so to enroll the people in the study. Then you have to wait a month and then do the booster. And then maybe it's another month after that until the vaccine's fully into effect. And so you're projecting now months out what the infection rate is going to be. And maybe it's the case that infection is going to stay at a high rate in the US indefinitely. And, but I certainly hope that's not the case. And I certainly think the government shouldn't be, counting on that being the case when making policy concerning, its plans for clinical studies. So I do think, I think that the future is unpredictable. And in some sense, there's a way in which I'm going to say, I hope that the vaccine candidates being tested in conventional phase 3s get great data very quickly, and that challenge studies cannot improve on that part of the process and might be able to improve on the parts about correlative protection, or might help be able to test different doses or test second generation vaccines. So in one way, I want to say I hope that's the case, but it's important to realize that hoping that's the case means hoping for lots of viral transmission, which is obviously something that we don't hope for and that we should not be planning for, and we should have backups for.
And I'm going to ask just one more question that's not exactly human challenge related, but just since there's so many scientific experts here, I'm just curious, vaccines typically, either produce antibodies, or they create T cells, or they create other immune markers. And I'd like just sort of like a brief understanding of sort of like what's the best strategy and which of the current vaccine candidates are doing that. Just, I'm a layman here, so.
Well, somebody else may wish to answer that, but what I will say to you.
Yeah, I can help you, Stanley.
Okay, go ahead.
You're the big expert in the word, but I can take that on. So, I mean, Laura, basically, we obviously don't have a coronavirus vaccine that's approved either for seasonal or SARS-1 or SARS-2 or MERS. But what we know based on animal challenges, that typically the protection is driven by a certain type of antibody called neutralizing antibodies. So those are capable of just blocking the virus, right? There are other types of antibody that binds to this, and what is their role exactly in protection is yet to be determined, and if they are important or not. Based on vaccine studies, currently we know on COVID-19, there is a correlation. So the more binding antibody, the more neutralizing antibody. And then the hope is higher is better. And then basically what the vaccine trial had done is compare them to people that had survived COVID with different level of severity, mild, moderate, severe, or critical disease, and then compared those neutralizing antibody to those that were convalescent. So again, we think based on the fact of current vaccine, based on challenge model with this virus, with others, and then based on the fact that typically respiratory virus vaccine had relied heavily on those neutralizing antibodies similar to influenza, although the vaccine is not great. So antibody is a big part, though we know actually there are other components of the immune system that are critical. So that one of them is actually what is the type of interaction that's going to happen with the T and the B cell to really morph this immune response to the best possible one. There are different types of immune response. The ideal one, we're looking at a Th1. That's the one that guarantees that there is not an enhancement of disease. So this interaction of B and T cell can either induce a good T cell response, and it can also induce a long-term B cell memory response, because that's key. What we know from prior coronavirus infected people with SARS and MERS is actually that immunity decrease over time. What we also know from experimental vaccine with coronavirus is actually the antibody decreased quite a bit after a few months. So that's really kind of we need to know the duration of protection of people that get naturally infected or actually immune from getting the vaccine.
Thanks so much, Nadine. Any other questions from journalists?
If I may, two questions. The first, I'm asking this mainly because this is a point that's out there in the debate, so I want to give you the opportunity to respond to it. There is the argument out there that there is so much uncertainty about what the coronavirus is, how dangerous it is, and obviously about any candidate vaccines, that nobody can be informed enough, even the bright, very well informed people volunteering to do these tests, that they can give informed consent. I would be interested in just getting on the record what the response to that point is. And then once after that, it would be very useful, I think, if we could hear a little bit more about how this idea started, how this many people had the idea to set up this group and have this much success with getting interest in it, because it's a remarkable phenomenon that you're asking a lot of people to be very public spirited and take a risk. But the first question I'd just like to ask is there any validity to the notion that it's impossible to give informed consent to such a challenge trial?
Maybe I'll try and answer. The idea that there should be no unknowns would make informed consent to be a subject of an experiment virtually impossible. Of course, when you volunteer, you don't know if the intervention works, and that's why they're doing the trial. So there's always uncertainty. There's degrees of uncertainty. So is the claim that there's more uncertainty here? Well, the subjects can also be apprised of that fact. And once they've been apprised of everything that the scientists know, then they know what the deal is. Of course, it'd be desirable if we could pin it down more, but if it's not unusual at all for there to be many unknowns. And let me say a word also about the background here. There is, I think, and maybe Josh can speak more authoritatively about this, but in recent years, there's been a remarkable movement that goes by the name of effective altruism, which has in part been driven by some philosophers at Oxford and won adherents all over the world. At Harvard, there's an enormously active chapter, undergraduate chapter, of mostly young people who have decided that they should be more altruistic than they might otherwise be inclined to be, but also that if you're going to be altruistic, it's your business to try to figure out how to be effectively altruistic, because that's the point of altruism. And so they hold meetings where it's sort of like going to a marketplace. Look, I've got an intervention where you can save this many life years. Oh, I've got one where you can do even more, and so on. And this is an outgrowth of that. Some of the people who are involved, both on the volunteer level, but also on the advisor level, have been involved in effective altruism. There are people from effective altruism who have walked into transplant clinics and said, look, I've got 2 kidneys, I only need one. Why don't you take one of my kidneys and give it to whoever you think would be a good recipient? In fact, I think one of those people is on this call right now. And so it's not a surprise that so many people jumped to the fore when this was announced.
Fascinating, thank you.
And John, before getting to your second question, which I suspect Josh and others are better positioned to answer, I mean, one of the arguments that moved me is, despite the uncertainties and unknowns, I believe there are now some empiric data that would suggest that amongst the very young and those without pre-existing conditions, the risk of dying might be as low as 1 in 10,000. But let's say it's 1 in 1,000. Let's be pessimistic. Contrast that 1 in 1,000 to the fact that if you were an American soldier who was sent into battle in any of a number of wars, your chance of dying was about 1 in 100. And frankly, in some cases, those soldiers weren't volunteers. So I think you're right about the uncertainty, but there are some empiric data starting to come in that at least maybe give us a sense of what sort of risk one is taking on in a quest to help your fellow man.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll answer both of those a bit. So first on the uncertainty side, it's been interesting, kind of doing this work for the past, I guess about 4 months now. And, on the one hand, we've learned a lot about the disease and the empiric data about the disease. And so we do have a lot more confidence of what's the mortality, what's the infection fatality rate for young and healthy people. And that rate has, unsurprisingly gone down over time as clinical treatment has gotten a little bit more sophisticated for it and has more knowledge. So, when we started, there was a piece that was published in Lancet Infectious Disease that found that in China, 20 to 29-year-olds, the risk of dying if you were infected healthy and unhealthy, was about 1 in 3,300, which is coincidentally actually the same risk of dying that kidney donors have. But then actually recently there was a piece published in Science with data from France that found that 20 to 29-year-olds, again, healthy and unhealthy, that rate is about 1 in 14,000 people dying, right? So we have, and again, that's healthy and unhealthy. If you look at just healthy people, you know, about the CDC, for example, has found that about 92% of people hospitalized in the US for COVID had at least one comorbidity. And so if you look at things like the rate of hospitalization, you know, we have pretty good data, I think, about how likely, or at least sort of an upper bound of risk for both mortality and for severe disease. And I think we can say, you know, based on the existing data, not just from China and France, but also from, there's not peer-reviewed data yet, but there's data from Stockholm and Geneva in Italy as well. We can say the risk of death is very likely to be lower than 1 in 10,000, which is lower than the risk of kidney donation and lower than the risk of childbirth, which is about 1 in 6,500. And I think, and this, the numbers are not in front of me as much, but I think that like the risk of severe disease for a 20 to 29-year-old who's healthy is probably something like 1 in 1,000 or maybe a bit less. Now, the thing that is troubling, we've learned more recently, is that there can be sort of medium-term or longer-term consequences of COVID in terms of fatigue or neurological symptoms or all sorts of things that are not necessarily, you know, correlated to, we don't know how much connected they are to severity. And that is certainly worrisome, and that is something that to be considered. But I think, yeah, I would definitely point to Dr. Kalin's point about, you know, that we, and to Professor Wickler's point that, you know, we never know all the consequences, you know, certainty of all the consequences of our actions, and that there's, you know, a lot of contexts where there's tremendous uncertainty, like serving in war. And then, you know, so I'm one of those people who gave a kidney to a stranger that Dan mentioned. Actually, AB is another one. And I'll mention with that, you know, so on the one hand, people have been donating kidneys for more than 50 years now. Living people have been donating kidneys. But actually, you know, when I donated in 2011. And at that point, you know, the best scientific data was that there's no increase in your chance of kidney failure if you donate a kidney. Turns out in 2014, with more sophisticated epidemiological tools, it turns out that your risk does go up. It goes up by about 1 percentage point, or, you know, from basically a very low level of about 0.1% to something like about 1%. So it's not enormous risk in absolute terms, but, you know, it's, you know, no one before then, it's not the case that the people who donated before then that was unethical for them to do so, or that they weren't reasonably informed. There was obviously uncertainty. There was uncertainty when I donated. That's fine. But even something that people have been doing for decades can have uncertainty. And so I think that it's also, you know, I think that it's okay for people who are to be well informed about what those risks might be, even if we don't know the percentage or the number of all those risks. And we allow that in a lot of other different contexts. And the last thing I'll say about this is that I think it's important to realize that insofar as the risk and the uncertainty there goes up, the benefit also goes up, right? So it's obviously, you know, we certainly don't want to be in a situation as people who might be able to participate in a study of having a significant chance of longer term harm. But if that's the case, that means there's all sorts of young and healthy people who are already having, long term harm now. And so everything that can be done to avoid that needs to be done. And so it's not just a factor that affects the risk of the trial side, it's also a factor that equally affects the need and the urgency of the trial side. So, sorry. Oh, go ahead. Maybe we can answer the question about how things started.
Well, I was going to say, I just want to welcome Professor Abigail Marsh to the call, and serendipitously, Professor Marsh studies the psychology of altruism at Georgetown. And Professor Marsh, the question was from John Authors about sort of just remarking on how incredible it is that so many people have decided to sign up expressing interest for a human challenge trial. And not to put you on the spot, but I was wondering if you can speak about, in your studies, about the psychology of altruism, how that relates to the outpouring of support we are seeing right now for a human challenge trial.
Absolutely. Yeah, so, you know, what's I think really remarkable in the history of kidney donation, and sorry I had to chime in late here, I was wrapping up another meeting earlier, But what's remarkable, if you look at the history of kidney donation, is that it was, of course, banned to donate a kidney to a stranger long after it was technically possible, mostly because psychiatrists and transplant professionals couldn't believe that an informed, sane person would ever want to make such a sacrifice for somebody they'd never met before. They basically didn't believe that anybody's values could legitimately encompass truly altruistic goals. And only when I think it became a matter of desperation and somebody was willing to give it a shot, a transplant surgeon named Reginald Goh, I think of Brown, finally was willing to give it a shot, did people believe otherwise? And the research we've been doing recently on all sorts of altruistic populations suggests that people who make sacrifices for strangers, they just actually place more value on the welfare of other people, contrary to the sort of long-standing myth that the only kind of value a person can have is a fundamentally selfish value, which is not true. And so what we've been seeing in the brief self-reports from people who are signing up for challenge trials is that's exactly what's going on. It's not that they're particularly insensitive to risk. It's not that they're poorly informed. It doesn't look like. It seems like they actually are people who care about helping other people. It's very compatible with their values. It's not that they're ill-informed or that there's something wrong with them. So I think this looks a lot like what we've seen in the history of kidney donation.
Thank you. Oh, yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
And to that, it reminds me, I was on the, what was then the Institute of Medicine panel on death and dying in America. We did the last publication on dying in America, and my role there was to remind us as we looked through the data that the public narrative is going to be within the story. And even as we understand that people are going to be convinced, by the percentages of those who might die or those who might have neurological damage afterwards, the way in which this is told to and explained to the public is the strength of the story that we construct around it. So I want to make sure, for example, that altruism is not culturally constrained, even though it may indeed be socially privileged, and to explain what that might mean so that all of us or all populations have equal access to being altruistic or being considered altruistic. So I don't want us to be overwhelmed so much by the data that we forget that the motivation for this for people, both in believing in the efficacy or the reasonability of a challenge trial as a participant or as a member, I'm much too old to participate, but as someone who had ended up being a signatory to the letter, is because of the nature of how we can tell a story that convinces the public, as I said earlier, already tainted by a politic that is not to our benefit, that this is a social good.
Thank you. I believe we have time for perhaps one more question.
This is Laura Parker at NetGeo. Oh, I guess I'm not turned on here.
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, there. Given the speed with which some of the, and this question may have come up earlier, and forgive me for being repetitive, I just got out of another media call. Given the speed with which the other trials that are moving into phase 3, where do things stand now with the human challenge trials, just in terms of does anyone think that there may actually be one that actually happens? And if so, is it still Oxford who would be the likely place that would do it? I mean, kind of give me a sense of what's actually happening on this at this point in end of July.
Nadine or Josh, do you want to speak on this point?
Nadine, do you want, or I can if you don't want.
Yeah, I mean, I think Josh can fill in the details. I mean, great question. It's exactly what we've been discussing on the call, just the importance of timing. We feel we're already many days later, in a sense, here. Yes, I think that there are efforts across the many private companies here in the U.S. to manufacture a challenge study that's under GMP, and there are some discussions also at institution here within the U.S. that have a high level of biocontainment to take that upon. I think a little bit of the hesitancy, obviously, is with just the regulatory hurdles with the FDA, with the local IRB, and this big responsibility of first do no harm, but nonetheless we're infecting people with coronavirus. I think the Oxford team had expressed obviously the most interest in being a lead in that, and whether the challenge stock will be made in the UK or in the US, I think this is yet to be determined.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the last, I think there was a previous question that did cover that, so I think maybe you can send you the recording and you can,
sure.
But I'll just make a bit of a different answer than was given there. And one is that really just kind of following on something Adrian Hill at Oxford has said about this, that challenge studies are also a complement to the phase 3 studies and not a replacement for them, because we can't necessarily assume that the exact dose that's being tested in those studies or the vaccines that are being tested are going to be the final dose or the best vaccine that's ever going to be developed. And so having the challenge model be developed and be able to be tested, that's going to be really useful for things like, perhaps testing different doses of an existing vaccine or different methods of delivery, possibly testing different adjuvants or sort of like a helper or kind of booster protein to go with vaccines. Those can be functions of challenge studies, and also understanding some of the science of how a vaccine is working, these so-called correlates of protection. That's also going to be quite valuable. For example, that if we in our phase 3 can find that a vaccine is effective, if we are also able to know the correlates of protection through a challenge study, that might be able to help us prove its effectiveness in older or higher risk populations more quickly. So, yes, I think there's a lot of reasons to say challenge studies still could be helpful, just on the kind of basic efficacy, getting efficacy faster than a phase 3, but they're also complements and will be helpful and useful even if the phase 3s go, very well and get data very quickly.
Thank you.
So we are almost out of time. I just wanted to squeeze in one more technical question that we've been getting from a fair amount of volunteers. So in our biweekly newsletter for One Day Sooner, we do our best to provide resources for other opportunities to sign up for traditional conventional phase 3 trials to our volunteers. And some of our volunteers have asked whether or not participating in a phase 3 trial, let's say for Moderna, will necessarily preclude their participation in a potential challenge trial. And this is a question I wanted to see if perhaps Stanley had an answer to, or someone else on the panel.
Well, let's say that a phase 3 trial shows that the Moderna vaccine does work. And then, as Josh just said, there would be an analysis of what are the immune responses that seem to be protective. Then in a challenge trial, you could test another vaccine to determine whether or not they achieve the same type of response and are able to protect against a challenge that presumably the Moderna vaccine will also protect against. So, and I could just add that once one or two vaccines are shown to be effective, let's say in phase 3 trials, it's going to be increasingly difficult to do phase 3 trials on other vaccines, simply because people will want the vaccine that's already been proven. And so that challenge trials, which we've talked about as being something to do now to give us some scientific hints about what to do, they may prove to be useful in order to produce 7 billion or 14 billion doses of effective vaccines for the entire world population, because one company is not going to be able to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Plotkin. Okay, so we are at an hour, and I appreciate everyone's time. Don't want to take up any more. And yeah, in addition to expressing my gratitude for everyone taking the time to be on this call, I wanted to say just again that many bodies who have written about the preconditions for challenge trials to take place have included public engagement as part of that. And so beyond this being simply just an incredibly fascinating conversation and an opportunity for some, I think, amazing journalism, I think well-informed journalism about challenge trials serves an important social function in informing everyone about challenge trials. So thank you everyone so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I will distribute this video to everyone that was in the call once it's done.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.